2020 has definitely been one different college football season, but one thing remains. Alabama's in contention for another national championship, but still some work to get done, of course, in the SEC. We got Gary Harris on the line from WVUA Channel 23 in Tuscaloosa. Gary, how you doing?
Good afternoon, Mark. I'm well. Like you said, it's been a different kind of season, but we're hanging in here, and we can see the finish line. Hopefully we will reach it.
Yeah, some things don't change. Alabama's undefeated. One more game. It's not the Iron Bowl. That one's in the past, a 29-point whipping of Auburn. So it's a game against Arkansas. And before we really focus in on the Tide, I got to think as an SEC guy that you're finding a little bit of pleasure in watching Arkansas bounce back, show a little bit of life, a pulse under Sam Pittman. The program's really been dead for a couple of years, but they've had a fun season to watch.
I really am. I'm like everybody else in the SEC. It's a feel-good story when you consider that Chad Morris went 0-16 in 2 seasons in the Southeastern Conference. They hadn't won a conference game since 2017, and the guy's 3-6, but he's in contention for SEC Coach of the Year for good reason. Easily could be 6-3, Marcus. Just as easily as they. The bottom line is, you are what your record says you are. They're 3-6, but they've won 3 SEC games after not winning a single one the last 2 seasons. And with a play here or there, or maybe a call that goes their way, specifically like in the Auburn game, they might be 5-4 or 6-3. They've been competitive in just about every game that they've played. They play hard. They have had times when they've been able to run the football. They've other times when they've passed the ball very well defensively. They started out really strong. Now they've let up a little bit in terms of the statistics here lately. Florida rung up some big numbers. Missouri rang up some big numbers this past weekend. But they're a very competitive team, and they'll be excited about playing Alabama Saturday. You know that. I mean, it is truly a case of everything to gain and nothing to lose for Arkansas. I mean, they are one of those teams that they go out there, they play hard, they stay competitive in the game, and make it a third or fourth quarter game, and they're going to feel good about themselves. I don't know if Felipe Franks is going to start at quarterback or the other kid, but either way, I think they'll try to make some plays on offense.
We're talking Tide with Gary Harris from WVUA 23, sports director there in Tuscaloosa. So when you talk Alabama football, you can do no worse, do no better, I should say, than talking with Gary here. So I don't know what the point spread is on this Arkansas game. I got to think it's pushing the 25-point range with 4 touchdowns.
Yeah, it's over 30.
Okay, it's over 30. I was leading into what was brought to my attention just a few minutes ago, Gary, is that the line for the SEC championship game is 14 over Florida, which Florida's playing lights out. Of course, prolific offense. That seems a little high, but when you consider a 28-point win over Texas A&M, 29 over Auburn, 17 over Georgia, maybe it's not inflated.
I don't think it is. They're 31 against Arkansas. Alabama's covered a large number of these lines, and you got to remember, Mark, that you've got to set. Those odds makers are setting that line to try to generate play on both sides. Ideally they like 50-50 because that guarantees them with the juice to make money. So if you set those lines with Alabama, let's just say they had set that LSU line. Of course, they'll adjust it as it goes, but most people thought that line would come out at maybe 22 or 23. It came out at like 28, went all the way to like 29.5 or 30. Because if they had set, they know what they're doing. If they set that thing at 22 or 23, all that money would have rolled in on Alabama. Then you'd have been trying to adjust the line, but it'd been too little, too late. So they're really, really good. You think about the line against LSU, and it's 45-14 at halftime, and Alabama did cover, but they didn't run away from the point spread. So 31 at Arkansas, I do think sounds about right, and 14 against Florida. Initially, you go, wow, 14 against Florida with that offense. But then when you look at Alabama, think about it. Again, if you're trying to set it from an odds maker's point of view, you can't go too low with that line. You've got to get it up high enough that you're going to generate some play on Florida. So they set it at 14. And to be honest with you, Mark, that's probably about right.
So, Gary, that said, I'm going to give you the impossible assignment. Find some weaknesses in this team. What do they need to work on? What is there anything there that Florida can exploit?
I think that there is. I think defensively they've gotten consistently better, which is what you want to do. But still, they, like most teams in this day and age with these prolific offenses, they're vulnerable to the big play. We saw it. LSU had 2 touchdowns And both of them came on big plays, even though the one time the kid dropped the ball before he crossed the end zone, LSU recovered that fumble. The other was on the long run play by Emory. And, when you're playing defense against a team like Florida with all those playmakers, all it takes is one mistake. It takes one guy that isn't where he's supposed to be, and you have a bust. And even in the Auburn game, Seth Williams got ahead of the defense by 10 yards. I mean, he just dropped the ball. So I think they're like most defenses now, Mark. They are vulnerable to the big play. I don't think you're going to consistently line up, and that's the great thing about Florida. They don't even try to run the ball. I don't think you're going to consistently line up and be a run-heavy team and have much success against this team. You're going to have to beat them through the air, but Florida has that potential. So I do think they're vulnerable in that regard. The good news for Alabama is, as they proved against Ole Miss, and really they proved all year long, is they can win a shootout against you. They can give up 40-plus points and still win the game. That's what makes them so hard to play against, is they can beat you in a lower-scoring game, they can beat you in a higher-scoring game, or in most cases, they just blow you out. And so, but I think Florida brings enough to the table offensively that they're going to get some points against Alabama. There's no doubt in my mind about that, Mark. The question is, can they slow down Alabama enough to, even with them scoring on offense, to keep that game competitive? We'll just have to see. Offensively, there are a lot of weaknesses for Alabama. One weakness is they lost Jalen Waddle, who might have been the most explosive player in the country. Now the most explosive player in the country might be Devontae Smith, his teammate. So they've still got weapons. You got Najee Harris. I think you've got three of the best players in the country at their positions on one offense. Mac Jones is certainly one of the best quarterbacks. Najee Harris, I think, is the best running back. And I think Devontae Smith is the best wide receiver. You add in a dominant physical offensive line that can pass, block, and also control the point of attack for the running game. You throw in some guys around them like Mechie that can make play. The young tight end Billingsley starting to make plays. And you just pick your poison. I mean, I just would, and I'm not a football coach, but I can imagine defensive coordinators just have nightmares trying to come up with a game plan and a way to scheme against this Alabama offense. And the good news for Alabama is, unlike most other years, Reichert hasn't missed a kick, a field goal, or an extra point. And the punting, that's an area where they're not great. Good news is they don't punt that often. Coverage-wise, they're terrific. Return game, even without Waddle, they're good. So not many weaknesses on that football team.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the game we love with the best broadcasters in the nation. We go to Alabama and Tuscaloosa and Gary Harris, WVUA 23. All right, Gary, you mentioned Mac Jones. He's putting together Heisman-type numbers, 27 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 76% completion percentage. But he doesn't necessarily get the credit that some of the other guys get because it's assumed that he's got the best playmakers and so forth and so on, which he does. But still, he is playing lights out. Maybe this SEC championship game becomes a bit of a Heisman finalist showcase for these two guys.
I think it could. I mean, touchdown passes is the big area where Trask has an advantage. But let's keep in mind, too, Florida has no running game. Trask plays basically the entire game, every game. Mac comes out of a lot of games. Plus, Alabama, Najee Harris has scored 20 touchdowns, Mark. They have a dominant running game. So when they're in the red zone, more times than not, they're running the ball in. I think if Mac Jones and this Alabama offense, Steve Sarkisian, were just dead set on him throwing 40-something touchdown passes, he could. Everywhere else, they're pretty even statistically in terms of the completion percentage and the quarterback rating. And I do think it's a two-man race. I'd like to think that Devontae Smith could be a candidate. But you and I both know a wide receiver is not going to win that award unless he's also returning kicks and punts and maybe playing cornerback or something like that. And Najee Harris, as good as he is, he's not going to win it. So I do think it's down to Jones and Trask. Trevor Lawrence is, had he not missed some games, he's going to be the number 1 overall pick, but I don't think he's going to win the Heisman. And I think Justin Fields' body of work, Mark, just isn't large enough, particularly now that he's not going to play Ohio State. Ohio State's not going to play Michigan this Saturday. So I think it's Jones, and I think it's Trask. And, I think it's easy to say Trask is more important to his team because of the things that we've mentioned with Alabama, all the playmakers, the offensive line, and so forth, even though Florida obviously has playmakers, starting with Pitts, the tight end. But I think that Trask gets more credit for Florida's offensive success than Mac Jones does for Alabama's. But you said it. It's probably going to come down to this SEC championship game. And whichever quarterback performs the best, but particularly if his team wins the game, I have a strong hunch that the winning quarterback in that game, if he plays well, is going to win the Heisman Trophy. You agree with me there?
I do.
I think it's going to come down to that.
I think there's a possibility, though, that if Bama wins as expected, especially as a 14-point favorite, if they win a 3-point game, let's say it's a 48-45 shootout and Trask is ridiculous, that he still hangs on to the hardware because of the perception that he had to do more on that team. And you mentioned Devonta Smith, and I didn't want to let him go because I think we may see him go on to the NFL, and not everybody is realizing that they're watching a legendary career here. 80 catches, 15 touchdowns, and of course it all started, at least in regards to national attention, with the game-winning touchdown reception in the national championship game, and that is 3 years ago. Gary Harris talking Alabama football, the Tide taking on Arkansas this weekend. Then it's the SEC championship matchup against Florida. I posted a recruiting video comparing basically results in the SEC versus recruiting rankings and how that weighed out, who's underachieving, who's overachieving. And in measuring all that over the last 10 years or so, of course, Alabama makes it easy because all I have to do is add up a bunch of ones, one. And so the aggregate becomes like 1.3. So again, we've got a number one class in the SEC, number one in the nation. That's saying a lot because Ohio State gobbled up a ton of guys early that looked like a legendary class. And according to the 247 Sports Composite, Alabama's at number one. And of course, National Signing Day is coming up in this odd year, right in the middle of championship week next Wednesday. So highlight some of those guys that are coming in late under the wire.
Well, first of all, let me just say this, Mark. Alabama has a dynamic class, as you already alluded to. Number one ranked class in the country. They've already got 22 hard commits for this class. Some of the best players in the country at their position. J.C. Latham, the offensive tackle. Both of the Brockermeyers, offensive linemen out of Texas. Dallas Turner, defensive end from St. Thomas Aquinas down in Fort Lauderdale. Damon Payne, the interior defensive lineman from Bellevue, Michigan. Kool-Aid McKinstry, the superb athlete from Pinson Valley here in Alabama. I'm just rattling some guys off that are just incredible athletes. Christian Leary, the wide receiver out of Florida that is tough. A physical kid, even though he's only 5'9", he reminds some people of a Waddle in terms of his ability to make big plays. Jalen Milroe, the quarterback out of Tompkins High School in Katy, Texas. I mean, you just go on and on through these guys, and you're seeing highly talented recruits. Tim Keenan, an in-state interior defensive lineman, that's phenomenal. So they've got a great class already. But, yes, they want more, Mark, absolutely. That's the nature of Alabama. Xavier Worthy, the wide receiver from California, that's a longtime Michigan commitment and a dynamic player. I mean, I'm no talent evaluator, I'm no coach, but I know a great player when I see one. I think we all do. You put on the videos of Xavier Worthy, and you're just watching him leave people in the dust. And he's a little bit. I hate to say this because it sounds obvious, but he's slender. He's about 165 pounds, about 6'1". Reminds some people a little bit of Devonta Smith because he's tall and slender, but he's a lot more physical than you would expect of somebody that size. And that's like Demetrius Smith. Demetrius Smith is slender, but he's durable. He's tough. He can take a hit. And Xavier Worthy is a guy that right now, Mark, the feeling here in Tuscaloosa among the recruiting pundits is that he's going to flip to Alabama on National Signing Day from Michigan. Also, there are others that they are continuing to recruit. Xavier Sori, a linebacker out of IMG Academy in Florida, has narrowed it down to Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. They're in there with him. There's some other guys that they've got offers out to that they may or may not be able to sign. One thing is numbers wise. How many guys can they sign that are going to be able to fit into this class numbers wise? And that's just the reality of it. But Mason Smith is a big defensive tackle out of Louisiana that most people have assumed is going to go to LSU. But I'm telling you something, Alabama's in there. And you know how Alabama is when they're involved. These other schools just hold their breath. Shamar Turner, a defensive end out of Texas. I still feel like that's probably going to be A&M in the end, but Alabama's in there. Tamisi Adelier, another defensive lineman out of Texas that Alabama's battling for. Brian Thomas, a wide receiver out of Louisiana. Terrion Arnold, a safety out of Florida. These are all guys that Alabama's still involved with. So numbers are an issue, but at the same time, the Nick Saban way of doing things. He seems to always find room for great football players. So I do expect them. They're 22 right now. I think they might sign as many as 27, and they'll figure out a way to make the numbers work. Don't be surprised if they get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 more commitments.
And Gary, you know this as well as anyone. This is astonishing. I don't remember exactly what the numbers are, but in a case like Worthy, pulling him away from a school like Michigan, where he is going to be the number one wide receiver in the class, and he's going to be the number one wide receiver rated in terms of recruiting rankings on that roster, to pull him to Alabama, where he's going to be like the fifth or sixth rated wide receiver on the roster, is just ridiculous.
Yeah, not many other schools can do it. Mark, quite frankly. But Alabama has got the legitimacy with Saban. And then you see what you saw yesterday. Cam Sims, 5 catches for 92 yards for the Redskins against the Steelers, including a one-hander. He's a guy, Mark, that never really started here. He was a fourth or fifth option, but he's good enough not only to make a roster, but to be a key player. So what they're able to sell them on, these recruits, is, listen, you may not be the guy right away when you come to Alabama, the way you are at other schools where they tell you you're the man the day you get on campus. You may not be the man here. If you're good enough, you will be, because Saban will play a freshman if he's better than the upperclassmen. But if you come in here, you bide your time, you let us develop you, you have an opportunity to be a first-round draft pick, or even if you're not, because of the program, because of how many scouts they get, how many people come to the pro days here, even guys that aren't regular starters at Alabama. J.C. Hassenauer's another one. He started at center for the Steelers yesterday with Pouncey out. He didn't start a game here. He was a fifth-year senior. He finally started a game, I think, once they got to the playoffs and they had an injury. I think he started the semifinal game in the national championship game. And he didn't get drafted, but now he's with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he's starting in place of Pouncey, who's hurt. So that's the kind of, karma that Alabama has going that not many schools do. It's just, it's that kind of legitimacy. It's other players telling the recruits, listen, man, come here, get developed, and you can get everything you want. It may not happen for you overnight, but that's a good thing, too, that you don't necessarily come in and get worn out, in playing 3 or 4 years. So, yeah, it's ridiculous almost, the recruiting that's done around here, but the proof is in the pudding. And when Nick Saban first got here, Mark, he was selling a vision. Now he's selling results. 14 years worth of results, and they're not bad.
Yeah, Josh Jacobs on a weekly basis is carrying the ball more in the NFL than he ever did at Alabama.
Another great example. He never was a starter here. He really never was a starter, and he was a first-round draft pick. I mean, it's just phenomenal. Of course, I always say, this, if you can play, the NFL will find you. But if you're at Alabama, they can find you a lot quicker than they might at other schools.
Yeah, and when you say that very few other schools can keep up with that pace, I think you're being somewhat kind and stretching it just a bit. I don't really think anybody else can. For as good as Ohio State, Clemson, and Georgia are in recruiting, and they're phenomenal, and they're right there, but just the layers of talent that's available on the bench is just crazy.
It is, and it allows them, even last year when you lose a Tua Tagovailoa. And listen, Alabama didn't win the West. They didn't make it to Atlanta. They didn't get the playoff. By their standards, it was a down year. But a down year around here, 11-2. A down year in most schools, is 6-6 or 7-5 or a losing record. A down year at Alabama is just not making it into the college football playoff, because that's the first time they had not made it. And they're, obviously in good position to be right back this year.
And even a down 11-2, one of the losses, which, hey, if they complete the crazy comeback in the second half against LSU, they actually break the tie and they go over a historic LSU team.
Right.
And I'm watching the playoff just like I'm sure you were, LSU and Oklahoma, when it was 5 touchdowns separating the two teams in the first half. And I was thinking, I wish Alabama was there. They're the 4th best team in the country.
Thing that Alabama had going for it last year. And I feel this way. It doesn't matter. They didn't win the game. But I feel like had Alabama beaten Auburn, they would have gotten that 4th seed ahead of Oklahoma, and they'd had a rematch against LSU. Could LSU have beaten them again? Absolutely. They were that good. At the same time, could Alabama have beaten LSU? I think they would have had a much better shot than anybody else.
Yeah. Good stuff with Gary Harris. Just a wealth of experience and insight, obviously, on Alabama football. Gary, we appreciate you making the time for us. We know between games and conference championship coming up and, of course, all this recruiting, you've got all sorts of stuff on your plate. So we thank you so much.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be with the voice of college football, brother. I tell you that. You do a great job, and I appreciate you having me on.